Good morning, Westminster Presbyterian Church. It is so great to be with you during this time of Bible study. My name is Dr. Shively T.J. Smith. I am Assistant Professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology, and I'm excited about this time of engaging you around your current series called Reckoning with Privilege, where Christ leads the church when the world is disrupted. I want to engage for a few minutes around the topic that I'm using, that I'm involved in working with, thinking about, writing about, have engaged in other venues from preaching and teaching to, like as I said before, in scholarship around really looking at the crucifixions as ways of talking about these sort of disruptions that you are working with and this sort of reckoning that you are talking about in your series. So I want to pose as the topic, Watching Jesus Hang, reading the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion through African American biblical histories. And the purpose of these few moments really is to explore the literary representation of Jesus' death on the cross and the spectacle, and I'm using that word very intentionally, the spectacle of violence and execution interpreted in African American biblical histories. Now, a little bit of a disclaimer: to talk about African American biblical interpretive history related to any passage in the biblical text is to talk about a very long, rich, and varied history. So, needless to say, I will only give you a little taste of what I'm talking about here, hopefully as an opportunity for you to reflect and for you to go deeper in your own thinking about the accounts of crucifixion in the gospel stories, and to go further than what I am able to do. So this really is a presentation that is intended to be an invitation to you and your work going forward. Now, I would not be doing my good professorial task if I didn't give you a quick quiz at the beginning of this engagement. I want you to grab a piece of paper or a tablet or your phone, something where you can concretely type or write something, right? So I really want you to do the concrete capture of this moment. So I'm going to give you a moment to do that. And once you do that, I'm going to give you 30 seconds, about 30 seconds, for you to write down everything, every detail you remember about the gospel accounts of crucifixion stories. In 30 seconds, write down every detail you remember and recall about the crucifixion stories in the gospels. Starting now. 10 seconds. Stop. I want you to take that piece of paper, or even that if you wrote it into a device, and I want you to just go to a new page. Just leave it there. Don't do anything with it. We shall return to it hopefully at the end. But I want you to keep that there. Don't think about it, and follow me through the rest of this presentation. When we talk about the gospel accounts, and talk about the gospel accounts of Jesus' crucifixion, it's really important to recognize that we're talking about four different accounts from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? That one of the ways in which we end up hearing the gospel, all four of the gospel accounts come in line with each other and fundamentally sort of line up side by side on this point in agreement, is the crucifixion moment. And so I want to take the time to pull one out in particular that I want to consider, which is Mark 15. So Mark 15, chapter 15 verses 25 through 37, and then verses 40 through 41. This is the one that I want us to focus in on for our short time together. Let me read it to you from the Common English Bible version just very quickly. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The notice of the formal charge against him was written, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 outlaws with him, one on his right and one on his left. People walking by insulted him, shaking their heads and saying, "Ha! So you were going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days? Were you? Save yourself and come down from that cross." In the same way, the chief priests were making fun of him among themselves, together with the legal experts. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross, and then we'll see and believe." Even those who had been crucified with Jesus insulted him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, the whole earth was dark. At 3, Jesus cried out with a loud shout, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you left me?" After hearing him, some standing there said, "Look, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, and put it on a pole. He offered it to Jesus to drink, saying, "Let's see if Elijah will come to take him down." But Jesus let out a cry and died. Some women were watching from a distance, including Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James the younger one, and Joseph, and Salome. When Jesus was in Galilee, these women had followed and supported him, along with many other women who had come to Jerusalem with him. I like using the Mark's version for this, to talk about the gospel accounts of crucifixion, and particularly Mark's gospel account of crucifixion, for the ways in which it unfolds and what we see occurring there. Broadly speaking, Mark's account of Jesus's death and crucifixion and the passion occurs fundamentally in 3 movements. This is sort of how I like to break it up in a bit. So the first movement is the process of capture. It's the process of capture itself. It's the time of indictment and the series of investigations and trials starting in chapter 14 up to chapter 15 verse 20. So we're talking about that trial and inquiry and interrogation period, right? This sort of inquiry into the circumstances that are raising questions leading up to Jesus' crucifixion. The second movement of Mark's gospel story is what we actually would call the passion narrative in Mark a lot of times. This is the period from Mark 15 verses 25 through 36, where we're talking about what I call the spectacle of Jesus' agony. The spectacle of Jesus' agony. This is the between time, or what one scholar, Victor Turner, would call the liminal space. The liminal space. Here, Jesus is between the beginning of his death-dealing predicament and its conclusion, which is death. And in the middle space, this liminal space, we see a series of onlookers or spectators, all of whom are flinging verbal attacks and sarcastic taunts at him as he struggles to breathe, as he struggles to live, as he struggles to believe that even in this horrendous moment, God is yet present. Others are spectators who are looking in silence, watching from a distance, unable to do anything about it, but to view the moment, to be present in the moment. This is really where I'm dropping us, obviously, in this second movement in Mark's account of the crucifixion and passion and death of Jesus. The third movement, the last movement in Mark's passion story, really is in the verses 37 through 41, where we see the death of Jesus occur. Verse 37, "But Jesus let out a loud cry and died." This in-between time, this period between the start of Jesus' crucifixion and its end in the Gospel of Mark positions us as spectators within the crowd. We are, so to speak, people sitting in the proverbial pews, looking up and viewing the unfolding speech acts of Jesus as he interacts with people and powers seen and unseen. There are no less than 5 moments of spectatorship in these verses that I want to lift up, in which Jesus' pain and suffering is spectacle for those in power and those who are watching. I want to really pay attention to this for a second in terms of this sort of the spectators. So let me list who I am talking about and referring to as spectators in this story, in case you didn't catch it. In verse 29, we see the spectators or onlookers who say, "Ha! So you are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, were you? Save yourself and come down from that cross." That's the first group. The second group of spectators we see is in verse 31, with the religious leaders in the name of God saying he saved others, but he can't save himself. The third group of spectators involved in this spectatorship, the spectator sports of crucifixion, is in verse 32. Among those who have no intention of believing God is God, even when she is standing right in front of them. They say, "Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down from the cross. Then we'll see and believe." Now, in some ways, I always say, this is a literary, rhetorical moment in the Gospel of Mark's accounting of this. Because the question we really should be asking is, really? Would they actually see and believe if that actually happened? What does it take for this group to not only see but believe, not only believe but see? And is that really possible? In verse 32, even those hanging next to Jesus, who are sharing the moment of violence and death with him, are there undermining and challenging who Jesus is, what is happening. They are participating in what I called this spectacle of agony. When I talk about spectacle of agony, I'm talking about the pageantry and theater of empire. The pageantry and theater of empire that frames moments like these as not just moments, but moments that are to be observed, learned from, in fact, set up as a warning to not repeat this, because this could happen not just to you, but to your entire kinship group. Speaking of kinship group, the fifth group of spectators that I pull out is verses 40 and 41. Here we see Mary Magdalene and the women looking on at Jesus. Jesus, who is their teacher, Jesus, who is their savior. But also what often gets missed, and what often is what we often fail to discuss, is their proximity is not just teacher and students and disciples, but their proximity is actually family. That this is a group-oriented, dyadic society. People understand themselves and have purpose and identity in relationship with, in kinship with, in family relationship with, configuration with others. So here in this moment, we get the spectators and of not just disciples, but the spectators of family watching as this happens. In this case, in silence. As this happens. The Gospel of Mark uses spectators in these verses to amplify the powerlessness of Jesus. These spectators intentionally exacerbate the situation by challenging Jesus to do the very thing he cannot do for himself in this moment, even though he has done it for others. This is the spectacle of agony. This is the theater of empire. the pageantry of the empire, when we recognize we are in a moment sitting in the pews, spectating and watching Jesus struggling to hold on to life and hoping that others maybe will help him, will join him, that maybe God will save him. Mark 15 sets it up that we as readers are spectators, that we sit in and are among the crowd looking around and watching the responses. And one of the things that I want to propose to you is that African American biblical interpretive history sort of comes in the room and sits right down in the theater. In the theater and in the pews spectating as well. That African American biblical interpretation has a particular view and perspective of this moment as one among many sitting there observing this moment when saying we cannot heal our bodies, even though we have healed the bodies of others. African American biblical interpretation comes in and sits down in the pew as spectators, saying, like Jesus, we face the reality that we cannot feed our bodies, even though Jesus fed the bodies of others. African American biblical interpretive history comes into the room as spectators sitting in the pews of this moment, saying, like Jesus, we face the reality that we cannot always save our lives, even though we have involved ourselves in the life-giving work that tends to the flourishing of others. African American biblical interpretation is a part of the spectators sitting in the theater, watching the pageantry of empire unfold, observing the perspectives and views and responses of others, even as it crafts its own. So it's very important to think about, before I move into some of the specifics of that, the sort of the history of African Americans and the Bible, the history of people of African descent in America and their engagement and reception of the biblical text. I cannot go into deep detail about that. We don't have the time. But if you really want to dive into that history, a book that I recommend is called The Talking Book, African Americans and the Bible. And here's just a quote from that I find very helpful for this conversation. Here, Callahan says this: African Americans have held fast to the Bible only by holding fast to its contradictions. Indeed, the contradictions suited their condition, for African Americans themselves incarnated America's greatest contradiction. They were slaves in the land of the free. As slaves, they were at the same time person and property. As people of African descent, they were heirs to a noble ancient history and an ignoble modern legacy. On the margins of American society, they remained at the center of its most bitter conflicts. Long after the fall of the slave regime, slavery's children bear the indelible marks of these contradictions. African Americans have held fast only to the Bible, only by holding fast to its contradictions. One of the characteristics of African American biblical interpretive history as it relates to reading and watching, attending the theater and play and pageantry of the crucifixion in the biblical text is the ways in which it resists trying to remedy or harmonize or ignore or diminish the contradictions of the moment. That the giver of life is now having life taken away from him. That life and death are both here, right? Hope and despair are both here. That the Savior is not saved, right? What it looks like that abandonment is here instead, rather than community, right? And presence, right? And that one of the real characteristics and features of the larger interpretive lineage that I'm interested in is the ways in which it holds these contradictions in tension as moments that need to be articulated, difficulties that need to be articulated as existential and real, rather than tensions that need to be diminished and overlooked. And that they not only are past biblical occurrences, but that in fact it has presence and resonance and occurrence, actuality, existence in the very history of Africans in America, this people of African descent in America. One of the big pieces about the biblical history that we need to hold in tension is the way that the biblical text was used and continues to be used as imagery that provides language to articulate not just the stories and histories of the biblical text, but to articulate the stories and histories of the present context, right? And the present concerns and experiences of people of African descent, of the diaspora in America. So what does it mean to think about African biblical interpretive history being one that holds the biblical text as a resource for language, as a resource of imagery, as a resource of articulating what is real and present versus simply forecasting what may be one day? So I want to take you to give you three particular instances in African American biblical interpretive history's engagement with the crucifixion moment. And I am going to sit us directly in the Harlem Renaissance period, in fact, in New York. So in the 1920s and 1930s, you have the flourishing of the Harlem Renaissance, which is where you end up getting all of these African American artists and writers and leaders sort of in this space of creativity, in this space of defining African American history and progress and identity in all different forms and ways, and engaging each other in this project in different ways. This text that I have for you is twofold. So the first is God's Trombone. So God's Trombones, 7 Negro sermons in verse, produced by James Weldon Johnson. This selection, called The Crucifixion, is actually the 5th sermon in the 7 sermons, poetic sermons, that he includes in this in this piece, which was published in 1927. The book of sermonic poems, as I like to say, or poetic sermons, as I like to say, is patterned after African American rhetorical and oratorical interpretive traditions. This is what James Weldon Johnson says about why he does this project and what he's trying to do. He says, it says it this way: I remember the history of the project. He says, I remember hearing in my boyhood sermons that were current, sermons that passed with only slight modifications from preacher to preacher and from locality to locality. Such sermons were The Valley of Dry Bones, which was based on the vision of the prophet in the 37th chapter of Ezekiel. The Train Sermon, in which both God and the devil were pictured as running trains, one loaded with saints that pulled up in heaven and the other with sinners that dumped its load in hell. The Heavenly March, which gave in detail the journey of the faithful from earth on up through the pearly gates to the great white throne. Then there was a stereotyped sermon, which had no definite subject, and which was quite generally preached. It began with the creation, went on to the fall of man, rambled through the trials and tribulations of the Hebrew children, came down to the redemption by Christ, and ended with the judgment day and a warning and an exhortation to sinners. So in many ways, God's Trombones represents, for James Weldon Johnson, his sort of artistic representation of that general sermon with these 7 major moves in it, as he's showing in his piece. Like the 5th one is The Crucifixion. Here we get this sermonic poem or poetic sermon in which it's much longer than this. I've given you 2 sections of it that I really love, that I think articulate a characteristic of African American biblical interpretive practice and engagement with the crucifixion that I find useful. And sitting next to it is a picture done by Aaron Douglas, who was considered in the Harlem Renaissance period the dean of African American painters, who created the imagery. So this is the image that goes along with the crucifixion sermon in God's trombone. I'll come back to the image in just a second. Let us read these two sections of the longer sermonic poem that James Weldon Johnson gives us. On Calvary, they crucified my Jesus. They nailed him to the cruel tree. And the hammer rang through Jerusalem's streets. The hammer rang through Jerusalem's streets. Jesus, my lamb like Jesus, shivering as the nails go through his hands. Jesus, my lamb like Jesus, shivering as the nails go through his feet. Jesus, my darling Jesus, groaning as the Roman spear plunged in his side. Jesus, my darling Jesus, groaning as the blood came spurting from his wound. Oh, look how they done my Jesus. Now, like I said, this is longer than what I've been able to give you here. But what I want you to notice about this reinterpretation of the crucifixion moment, particularly as we heard it from Mark 15, is the way in which this poetic sermon is animated by the sensory. That we not only have the instruments of crucifixion being named, the hammer, the nails, the spear being named, but look at how we actually get to hear the hammer in the way the verse is written. The hammer rang through Jerusalem's streets. The hammer. So that what we find happening in African American biblical interpretation, biblical interpretive engagement with the crucifixion, is this elevating and recognizing of not just the instruments of crucifixion, but the sensory dimensions of this moment. What is seen, what is heard, what is felt, what is tasted. And James Weldon Johnson articulates that, communicates the sensory angle of the crucifixion, that it is not just a disembodied moment that we remember, but that it is a full-bodied moment, and that the interpretive legacy of African Americans with this engagement is to capture rhetorically or in verse the full-bodied moment of the crucifixion, that there's something to be heard, there is something to be seen, there is something to be felt, there is something to be tasted. You see this duplicated in a particular way when you look at Aaron Douglas's portrayal of this, the crucifixion. Aaron Douglas is known for his silhouette art and the ways in which he uses shapes and silhouettes and shadowy figures to capture particular moments in African American history and then to give them texture, right? That his aesthetic is one of creating texture and identifying layers and levels to it, that there's more than just the superficial reading, that there's more to the story, there's more to see, there's more to unpack, there's more to unearth. So here, if you pay attention to this, look at this piece of art, you'll notice that there's actually circles, concentric circles shaping it. Here's a circle, here's a circle, here's a circle, here's a circle. He's sort of ushering us through looking at different levels, different moments, different layers to it. So these two are working together in tandem. The image, the silhouette image with this texture and layers that Aaron Douglas creates alongside of this poetic sermon that James Weldon Johnson gives of the crucifixion, in which it's animated by the sensory. It is paying attention to what is heard, what is seen, what is felt, what is tasted, how it is a full-bodied, a fully embodied interpretation of the crucifixion. The second image that I want to go to, the second piece that I want to go to very quickly is another person of the Harlem Renaissance and poet, Conte Cullen. Conte Cullen was an American poet, novelist, children's writer, and playwright. He's particularly well known for the work that he did during the Harlem Renaissance. In 1929, Conte Cullen published a book called The Black Christ and Other Poems. The poems examine the relationship of faith and justice, among African Americans. And in some of the poems, Cullen is equating the suffering of Jesus Christ, particularly at his crucifixion, with the suffering of African Americans, particularly with the rise of mob lynchings in the 1920s and into the 1930s. So he's intentionally trying to create an echo between the crucifixion proclamation and what's happening with African Americans in the country at the time. One scholar describes Cullen's work in this way, particularly in his book, in the larger book, The Black Christ. They describe it this way. In the opening of the book's narrative title poem, the protagonist sings of embracing God in spite of certain earthly obstacles that he summarizes as my country's shame. Notice, Cullen summarizes this as my country's shame. End quote. The speaker's brother has been beaten to death by a white lynch mob for an innocent relationship with a white woman. The narrator's resentment toward a savior who allows such evil to occur is overcome by his mother's proclamation of her unshakable faith, and any residue of doubt disappears when the murdered brother is resurrected. At the end, the family is left to prosper in its piety. Cullen's interpretation of Christ's crucifixion and African American violent struggles at the end of the 1920s is actually joined by other writers and artists of the 1920s like Langston Hughes, Jean Toomer, Claude McKay. But I want to pay attention to Conte Cullen and what he does here. Look at this in this poem, Christ Crucified, this sort of reinterpretation of the Mark 15 moment that we started with. The South is crucifying Christ again by all the laws of ancient rote and rule, the ribald cries of save yourself and fool. Then in his ear the thorns grope for his brain, and where they bite swift springing rivers stain his gaudy purple robe of ridicule, with sullen red and acid wine to cool. His thirst is thrust at him with lurking pain. Christ's awful wrong is that he's dark of hue, the sin for which no blamelessness atones. But lest the sameness of the cross should tire, they kill him now with famished tongues of fire. And while he burns, good men and women too shout, battling for black and brittle bones. I want you to take a moment to think about what it means to read Mark 15, the passages that we read, and to read it through this poetic version that Conte Cullen has created. Notice that Conte Cullen, as we've said, has taken the crucifixion moment and story and image, right, as a way to communicate the moment of violence and the moment of death and execution happening around African Americans in his time. So that beginning statement, the South is crucifying Christ again, turns the leaders, the chief priests, the scribes that are participating in this, along with the military, with the soldiers in this, into the South is crucifying Christ again in the sense of really turning it into this as current day actors participating in another form of crucifixion, participating in crucifying Christ again. That this is not a story of the past. This is a reoccurring moment, a reoccurring experience. that you don't have to look so far to see it happening again, to again be spectators of crucifixion. The last piece that I want to provide for your reflection and thinking about this longer history of African American biblical interpretive history and the ways in which it is reimagining, reinterpreting crucifixion, using the crucifixion moment to communicate something beyond just that past crucifixion moment, to make crucifixion, to bring crucifixion current, to render it present, a present real reality, not just a past recollection. Is here. James Barte is another person from the Harlem Renaissance. He's a sculptor. Up to this point, in addition to writings and paintings, we also have sculptors emerging who are engaged in this sort of reinterpretation of the crucifixion. James Bartee, who was a 20th century American painter, sculptor of the human form, he was from Mississippi. He installed several public installations that are very well known. This piece in particular is called The Mother, and it was created originally, intended to participate in the 1934-1935 exhibit called An Art Commentary on Lynching. So you can actually Google it and you'll find information about it. It's the 1934-1935 art commentary on lynching in America that was created at the time. This piece, The Mother, was supposed to be a part of that, and Barte decided not to include it and not to submit it. Now, what Barte was trying to do with this piece was to think past just the crucifixion moment to that immediate moment afterwards, and to put that in the bodies and the moments of particularly lynched male bodies in the country, and what it means, what happens once the death has occurred, the lynching has occurred, the mob has moved on, and the body is lowered to the ground. Who is there to receive it? Who is there to receive the body? Here we have the picture of the mother. So it calls The Mother. So the focus moves. He moves the focus from the lynched body and victim to the mother victim, to the family. Remember when I talked about in verses 40 and 41, we get that fifth group of spectators, not just the disciple, the women disciples of Jesus, but the family of Jesus. This piece is very striking because if you look very closely, Barte actually leaves the imprints, an image of the rope around the neck of the body, and as a way to talk again, to give this sort of full-bodied interpretation that the instruments used for death aren't immediately invisible, don't immediately go away, that the remnants of those instruments remain. And that's a part of the moment beyond what we see in Mark 15, but that is a reality for so many, is what he's trying to capture in the lynching culture of America at the time. Now, what's the other piece that's really important for me about Bartee's engagement here and Bartee's work here is the tension that he felt. So this is considered one of the most politically direct and politically charged sculpture pieces that Barte created. And Barte, you notice, was destroyed it 6 years later because of all of the press and all of the pushback that he was getting about this piece. So this also represents another aspect of African American biblical interpretive history and engagement, a tension that I think that we have to name, which is what happens when the creation of that interpretation, the naming of those moments are so painful, receive so much attention, pushback, challenge, that the interpretation is taken off the table, destroyed, removed, silenced, right? In fact. And so one of my arguments in a lot of my emerging work is talking about the ways in which the crucifixion and what it really represents, and sort of the spectacle of death, the spectacle, the pageantry of empire, the pageantry and theater of power, this full embodied experience. There's something to hear, there's something to see, there's something to taste, there's something to feel, right? That there are all these different forms of spectatorship and participation. That all of these aspects of it are at once opportunities to revisit and to reimagine and to understand and deepen and widen our understanding of the crucifixion, but that Barte's, the history of Barte's piece, the mother, is an example of how difficult it is, even for the interpreters themselves, be they artists, be they biblical scholars and commentary writers, be they you in the pews and in the world moving around. But that doesn't mean that these interpretations shouldn't be engaged and considered and shape how we understand and hold the crucifixion as potentially not just a past moment, a past disembodied spiritual moment, but that in fact that it's an embodied moment, a full-bodied moment that may in fact be very much present among us now. How do we render that? How do we capture that? How do we communicate that? And maybe how do we have the courage that maybe Barte didn't have, which is to allow the interpretation to stand and to be seen and viewed and felt, challenged, allow it to create the discomfort that is needed so that change and transformation might be possible. So I want to give you a moment to reflect. Again, I said this was just a really short taste of what I think is a deeper and richer conversation. I want to give you a moment to go get that piece of paper. Do you remember that piece of paper at the beginning where I told you I would not be doing my professorial duty if I didn't give you a quiz? I want to give you that quiz again. I want you to write down everything you remember and recall about the crucifixion now. Don't look at what you wrote before, per se. Write down what you remember and recall now in 30 seconds starting now. Ten seconds. I want you to take a look at your list, your past and the present, the first one and the second one. And I want you to think about what crucifixion looked like and what does it look, what it looked like before and what it looks like now to you. What did crucifixion sound like, if it had a sound at all, before? And what does it sound like now? What did crucifixion feel like, if it had a feeling at all? What does it feel like now to you? So I want to end with some reflection questions, and then we're going to have a Q&A, hopefully. So a live Q&A where we get to engage and go a little bit deeper. I really want to hear what you're thinking about this, and we'll love to unpack any pieces that I sort of went through very quickly. But here are 3 reflection questions that I want to leave with you. What details do you record or recall in the second quiz that were not in the first? I already gave you that one. Second one, what are the tools of crucifixion today that we need to be naming, right? Even repeating and sort of raising our awareness of and giving them a sound, as James Weldon Johnson does in God's Trombones. Number 3, what are the interpretive artifacts around us that reimagine the story as present and occurring among us today? What are the interpretive artifacts around us that invite us, create opportunities for us to reimagine the story differently from our original formations and recollections? And number 4, what are other challenging interpretations of the spectacle of crucifixion, beyond simply even African American biblical interpretive history, that we should use to shape our current recollections? And I put in parentheses that parenthetical citation, where are these other challenging interpretations of the spectacle of crucifixion we should use to shape our current recollections. I hope that this quick Bible study has given you some new angles and possibilities for revisiting the gospel accounts of crucifixion and considering them in light of the interpretive history of African Americans in this country, and in this case particularly African American artists from the Harlem Renaissance during the 1920s and 1930s, and what they have to offer us as commentary, perspectives, views of the crucifixion that we should be talking about, being shaped and informed by now. I look forward to talking to you hopefully soon. God bless. Blessings to you all.